So I got a fresh Alaska apple right here. If you're from Alaska, you know that's obviously not true. We don't get any of our fruit from Alaska. We ship it all up from the lower 48, and when it gets to Alaska, oftentimes it's already bruised, right? If you go to Costco, you want to find some good fruit, you end up picking through the fruit, and you still end up bringing home some of it that's got little blemishes on it and problems with it, and you say, well, that's just how it is in Alaska. Sometimes you got to put up with some blemishes on your fruit. Well, it's the Christmas season, and what we celebrate every Christmas is the coming of Christ, and Christ is known as our perfect sacrifice. And the idea of sacrifice, it's interesting. It's not something that we talk a whole lot about. But in the Old Testament, we see the sacrificial system being set up by God through Moses. And this whole process of giving sacrifices as an atonement to God for their sins. And so God's people have done this for generations. Even back in Genesis, we see when mankind first sinned, there was an apple involved, right? Could have been some other kind of fruit, but we'll just go with apple. But sin entered into mankind, and when that happened, they realized they were naked, if you remember that part. And God says, I'm going to actually make animal skins to clothe you. And this was the first time in the history of the world that blood was shed. And God actually was the one who shed the blood of these animals and covered his children with their skin. And this is interesting. Throughout the Old Testament, we see all of this foreshadowing ultimately of the Christ child who would come to take away the sins of the world. The one who would come as the final sacrifice that would provide forgiveness of sins. The one who would actually clothe us in his righteousness. So what does it look like for us to sacrifice? Well, for God's people, when they would bring anything, if it was a piece of fruit, what God demanded was that it was unblemished. Now, God's people would always be tempted to bring God their leftovers. I think we still are tempted to do the same today, right? Whatever I've got left, that's what I'll give to God. And God would say, that is not an acceptable sacrifice. That's not what I want. I want an unblemished sacrifice. And this was all imagery to show them the severity of their sin, and that our unholiness actually demanded something that was holy and perfect to provide a way back to God. And we know that ultimately all of the sacrifices, they were foreshadowing what would come in Christ, but they were never adequate. They were never enough. Like it wasn't enough to give of these things. That was just an act of obedience to God, a representation of what Christ would ultimately do. Christ was the perfect sacrifice. Christ was enough, and he still is enough. So what does it look like for you and I to sacrifice? And ultimately, when we worship, it's a real act of worship when it's an act of sacrifice. One of the things we hear a lot or might even say a lot is, man, I don't just get into worship much lately, or I'm not super into the worship. Or you might go visit a church and be like, man, I didn't really like the worship. And what I always want to say back to someone who says that is, great, it wasn't for you anyway. Worship has never been for you, but worship actually becomes worship when there's a sacrifice involved. And so I wonder for you, maybe that might shift the way that you see worship. Sometimes maybe you don't feel like you're into it, or maybe you're watching in an outpost or at home and you're thinking, this just feels weird to sing with a TV and do this right now. But I just want you to know, throughout history, worship has always been worship when there's a sacrifice involved. And so when we do that, when we worship, we don't stand there and kind of mutter some words or, sway around a little bit. We actually give God our very best. And again, we celebrate it every Christmas. The reason we give God our best is because he first gave us his best in the form of Jesus coming to earth as a child, being born of a virgin, growing up like all of us in stature and in wisdom, and then ultimately beginning his ministry that would lead him to a cross to be the perfect, unblemished sacrifice for your sin and mine. So let's celebrate that this Christmas, and let's be a people of sacrifice.